Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be sharing the 5 most important tips that I learned when filling cracks and knots in wood with epoxy resin. Check it out. Now, anyone that's worked with wood before knows that you're always going to come across pieces that have some imperfections. Like this piece here has a knot that goes all the way through it. Sometimes you'll find a board that's got some checking on it. I've got a crack here that goes all the way through. Usually on the end pieces, you're always going to get some checking because as the wood dries, it dries inconsistently on the ends of the wood, so you're going to get more cracking and checking on those ends. Now for a lot of people, they would just try to avoid using these pieces altogether, but that's not always practical for people, especially right now with lumber prices being so high. I feel like for your average builder, cost is one of the most important things. So a lot of times these pieces that might get thrown away, these pieces can actually become functional pieces. And one way to do that is to fill these imperfections and these knots and cracks with something like epoxy resin. Now there are many different ways that you can fill those knots and cracks depending on how big they are and how deep they are. I've got some options here on this table in front of me for some ways that you can do that. Some people opt to use something like a wood filler like I have here. This is a good option if you're planning on painting a piece, if you just need to fill some imperfections in, maybe fill a knot in. If it's going to be painted, this is totally fine to use in my personal opinion, because you can't really see a difference once you paint over top of it. They do make some stainable options. I personally don't find the stainable ones to be that great. I just feel like you can't get a good color match when using even the stainable ones, so I kind of try to avoid those unless I really have to use them for a piece. So that's one way that you could fill that. Like I said, it generally works best in my opinion if you're just painting over a piece. Some people use a combination of wood dust and glue here. So you take some basically leftover dust from sanding and collect that, and then if you mix that with some glue, you can create sort of a paste, sort of similar to the wood filler that you can then use to plug up holes. Now this is kind of similar to the wood filler where it does not accept stain or finish that great. So if you are planning on staining a piece, I would say these 2 options are probably not your best bet for trying to match that color. Now I personally like to highlight the knot itself. I think it adds character to the wood. So what I like to do for that is try to match the color of the knot. And a great way to do that, especially on like smaller knots and imperfections, is to use something like this black CA glue from Starbond mixed with some activator spray. Using the CA glue is super easy. All you have to do is add a little bit to your piece until it's full, and then you hit it with some of the activator spray and it will harden right up in a matter of seconds. Now you can do this several times if you need to build up the layers to get the thickness you need. However, this is only really recommended for filling more shallow voids, so this is a great option if you have a small void that you need to fill and you need to do it quickly. Now I'm in the middle of building a dining room table for a client, and I had some pretty big knots that I had to fill. Now these boards are over 1.5 inches thick, and some of the knots actually went all the way through, so I had quite a bit to fill. So for something like this, I decided that my best option for filling these would be to use epoxy. Now this was actually my first time ever using epoxy other than like the 5-minute epoxy type, and I did a ton of research beforehand just to A, make sure I was using the right type of epoxy, and B, that I was applying the epoxy correctly. So what I decided to do was that I would accumulate all the research that I did and I would put together a video, so that way if you're trying to use epoxy for the first time for something like this, maybe some of these tips will help you out. Alright guys, tip number 1 is make sure you're using the right type of epoxy. There are an endless amount of options out there right now for picking out an epoxy, so it's very important that you do some research and figure out exactly what type of epoxy that you need for your project. Now I basically think it comes down to the depth of pour that you're using the epoxy for. Let's say you plan on pouring a river table, then obviously you're going to need a large amount of epoxy. For deep pours, you typically want to use what is called thick set epoxy. Think thin when you're talking thick set. I know that may seem confusing, but just think of the thick set as having a thin consistency. This thin consistency allows it to work its way into every little nook and cranny. Thick set epoxy or deep pour epoxy has a much longer working time and a slower cure time, so it gives you more time to fill things in before it starts to harden on you. But what about something like filling a knot in wood? It's not that big of an area, so you might think that you don't need to use something like this. Well, it depends on how deep your knot is. Now for the table I'm working on, some of my knots went all the way through, so they were over 1.5 inches deep. Most epoxies that aren't thickset epoxy don't recommend pouring single layers over 1/4 inch thick. And that's because mixing epoxy resin creates something called an exothermic reaction, which basically just means that it generates heat. So if you pour more at once than is recommended, it can generate too much heat and can crack your epoxy, which no one wants. Now, you could build up your layers over multiple pours, but I find that to be way too time consuming and inefficient, especially if you have a lot to fill. By using a thickset epoxy, I can fill these large knots in a single pour. Yes, it might take longer to set up and cure, but it gives me more time to work with it, and I can make sure that the epoxy is able to fill in all the areas that I need it to. Now, if you have a smaller area you want to fill, you could go with something like Total Boat's High Performance Epoxy, which has a much quicker cure time than the thickset epoxy does. It comes in different speed hardeners that you can choose depending on how much working time you need. I have a fast hardener here, which basically gives me about 10 minutes of working time, so you really want to make sure that you know exactly what you want to fill and you're not trying to fill a ton of things, because you're really only going to get about 10 minutes before this starts to really set up on you and you can't really use it anymore. So if you do need more working time, then you just want to go with a slower hardener. These come in fast, medium, and slow hardeners, so you just want to make sure that you get the right one that you need for your project. So basically, to wrap up tip number 1, evaluate the depth of the area that you need to fill and decide whether you need to use a thickset epoxy or not. Making sure to use the right type of epoxy is critical to getting the best result. Tip number 2, make sure you're using the right ratio of epoxy to hardener. Now, each type of epoxy has a different ratio to follow in terms of mixing the two. Now, you could measure this out and figure out the ratios yourself, but what I found to be incredibly helpful was to purchase the specific ratio pumps from Total Boat, since I was using this Total Boat epoxy. I'm sure other epoxy brands also have something similar to this. Now, this completely takes the guesswork out of it. It's as simple as using 1 pump of hardener for every 1 pump of epoxy. Makes it pretty hard to screw up. It's important that you take the time to mix the two together well. The recommended time for mixing is about 2 to 3 minutes. Also, if you're going to add any sort of pigment, make sure that that's fully mixed in as well. When it comes time to mixing in pigment, I just make sure that I keep the amount I add in consistent with each batch that I mix up, so that my pours are basically all the same and I don't have some that are noticeably lighter or darker than others when it comes time to fill in knots. For tip number 3, make sure to clean out all of the debris from your knot and apply a seal coat first. Before applying any epoxy, make sure that you have thoroughly cleaned your knot and chipped away any loose pieces. A lot of the times there will be a bit of dead wood or fibers hanging around in a knot, so really take the time to clean it out and then vacuum or blow out any remaining dust. It's also a really good idea to apply a sealing coat to your knot before you fill it. Basically, just mix up some epoxy and then brush it into the knot and allow it to cure before applying the rest of your epoxy. Basically, this helps trap any of that remaining debris so it doesn't end up getting mixed into your epoxy. Tip number 4, make sure to use a good quality tape to seal off the underside of your knot. You also want to make sure that you do all the prep work that you need to do to make sure that you prevent a huge mess. If you have a knot that goes all the way through your piece, or perhaps you have somewhere that epoxy can leak out of, make sure that you take the time to fully tape that area off. Use a good quality tape that epoxy won't stick to. I personally tried out a bunch of different tapes beforehand to see what was going to work best for me. I tried Gorilla Tape, Painter's Tape, and Tyvek tape. The Tyvek tape was hands down the best performer for me. Now, I know this stuff is expensive for tape. It's like $15 a roll, but it will save you a big mess, which I think makes it worth the money. So take the time to tape everything off well, maybe even hitting that tape with a heat gun to really help it adhere well, and you will save yourself a huge mess. Basically, the goal is to only get epoxy where you want it, which is in the knot itself. Otherwise, you will just have more to sand off later. Another thing that I feel helps with keeping the epoxy just in the knot is to apply it with these craft syringes. Now, I picked up some of these off Amazon and used them to fill all my knots and cracks with, and I think they just help keep things a little bit cleaner and give me less to sand off later. Alright guys, my final tip, and arguably the most important when it comes to filling knots with epoxy, is to make sure that you're paying attention to your temperature. Epoxy, just like most of us, does not like to be cold. Thickset epoxy especially prefers a warm temperature to cure in, typically around 77 degrees. Now, most of us can't keep our shops 77 degrees in the middle of winter, although we would like to. So you're gonna have to find a way that you can sort of control that temperature to make sure that you get the best result when it comes time to curing. Now, I couldn't maintain a 77 degree environment, but I tried to stay above the minimum of 65 degrees. And how I did that was basically I just created a bit of a warm room using some tarps and a heater that I enclosed the table in to help it cure. It did cure just fine, but it did take a bit longer than the suggested cure time. So just know if your temperatures are a little cooler, then you will need to allow more time for your epoxy to harden before you can sand it. Now, this high performance epoxy from Total Boat, especially mixed with the fast hardener, can be applied in a little bit cooler temperatures. I think the minimum temperature on here is 55 degrees. Whereas the thickset epoxy has to have a minimum temperature of 65 degrees. So if your shop's a little bit cooler, or you're trying to do epoxy work in the wintertime, then this is a great option for being able to do that. All right, there you have it, guys. 5 tips to help you get started filling cracks and knots in wood using epoxy resin. I hope some of these tips just help answer some questions you might have had about the process. I know when I was doing my research, I just had so many questions, and I personally learned so much from just experimenting with it on my own that I wanted to be able to share some of that insight with you guys, so I hope you enjoyed it. And hey, if you're looking for some epoxies to use, I've got all of the products that I used in this video linked in my description box below, so go check that out. And also, hey, if you liked the video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. And with that said, I'll see you guys for my next video. See you later.